to today's Irish Studies seminar. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome today's visiting speaker, who is Dr. Pauline Collombier. So Pauline is a senior lecturer at the University of Strasbourg in France, where she teaches British and Irish history. She was awarded her PhD from the University of Paris 3, Sorbonne Nouvelle in 2007. And in 2023 received her accreditation to lead research, which is a kind of second PhD in the French academic system. Her work, which is very extensive, publications very extensive in the field of 19th century history, British-Irish relations, home rule, and Ireland and the British Empire. I had the great pleasure of co-writing a book with Pauline back in 2015 on the Great Irish Famine. And we're here really to talk about her most recent book, which is this wonderful book, an important book, Imagining Ireland's Future, 1870 to 1914, Home Rule, Utopia, Dystopia. It's published by Paul Greig Macmillan in 2023. And the book explores the ways in which the future of Ireland under Home Rule was imagined as a utopia by, obviously, promoters of Home Rule, and as a dystopia by unionists, both in the kind of political discourse generated around the Home Rule bills, but also in imaginative literature, in the fiction, popular fiction created around Home Rule at the time. And Pauline's going to talk to us about a dimension of that today, and also some more recent research associated with it, on how this affected women. So the topic is Women and Home Rule, Some Insights from Fictional and Non-Fictional Sources. Pauline, good to have you here. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for being present in the flesh, and also thank you to the people online. So let's begin. So since the late 1980s, there's been a noticeable increase of interest from historians into the question of women's involvement in Irish nationalism and politics. New works and more works have been published on specific late 19th century and early 20th century female activists and the organizations they joined or formed, especially militant organizations and radical activists. Maybe because women were deprived of the right both to vote and sit in the British Parliament, and maybe because leading figures of the Irish parliamentary party, such as Parnell, Dillon, or Redmond, proved hostile to women's open participation in politics, little work has been devoted to the connection between women and Home Rule, as well as between women and constitutional nationalism. Exceptions include Diane Urquhart and Maria Luddy, who with a few other scholars have produced research on women in politics in Ireland, and especially on women unionists. Senia Paseta also recognizes that being a female nationalist did not necessarily mean commitment to Irish separatism, and that the history of advanced nationalist women is much better known and understood than the history of constitutional nationalist women. Yet, if we were to tackle the relations women may have had with constitutional politics, and if we were to tackle their interests in the Irish Home Rule debate, we would be faced with the questions and challenges that usually arise when dealing with women's history, and more generally when adopting a history from below approach. One of these questions is, and you know it very well yourselves, which sources should we collect and look into? While she only dealt with Ulster, where the level of female participation in nationalist politics remained lower than elsewhere in Ireland, Diane highlighted that there were sources problems involved in a study of the nature she undertook. In the case of Ulster, these problems range from the existence of very few private papers to an absence of records that related specifically to female nationalist organizations, and the dearth of press comment regarding women's political work. These problems might have been exacerbated in Ulster due to the specificities of the sectarian, political, and class divide in the province. However, one may assume that they could also be faced when dealing with the rest of Ireland, as women were neglected figures of history for a fairly long time. The book I published, and which Peter kindly mentioned, Imagining Ireland's Future, has put me on a path to exploring this issue further, thanks to sources I came across during the preparation of the book. As Peter explained, Imagining Ireland's Future assesses the way politicians, artists, and writers in Ireland, Britain, and the Empire imagine how self-government would work in Ireland after the restitution of an Irish Parliament. To do so, it relies in part on a body of about 30 predictive fictions published between 1870 and 1914. 3 of these fictions were published by women, anonymously or not. These 3 works alone clearly show that fiction was a medium which allowed women not only to express political views, notably on home rule, but also to hone these views. Other works in this corpus of future fictions were not written by women, they were written by men, but they are relevant to the topic under discussion today, insofar as they jointly discuss Irish politics and the issue of women's rights. Some of these works also include female characters that are particularly interesting because of the rather positive and empowering image of women they give, at least for the period. So the first half of this presentation will focus on some of these particular narratives as a way to illustrate how fiction can give us insight into what women thought of home rule and into how female and male novelists concerned with this issue envisaged the position of women with regards to politics, and the position of women in the future Irish or British state. In the second half of the presentation, I will evoke other sources, focusing on illustrations and more specifically picture postcards, so as to show how they too can contribute to shed further light on women's connection to the home rule issue. And this is a presentation relying on former work, but it's also, I'm transitioning to a new project, as you can tell. And I'm going to evoke paths and possibilities that I'm considering to undertake. But I'm coming to Belfast on a sort of fishing expedition. So I'll be glad to answer questions that you have at the end. But what I'm looking for is comments, advice, suggestions, if you have any. So I'm going to start evoking future fictions written by female authors, by women. I ended up 3, as I said earlier. A short story published anonymously by Lady Augusta Gregory in 1893 entitled The Phantom's Pilgrimage. By that stage, Lady Gregory was in the early stages of a literary career. She was to meet William Butler Yeats the following year, 1894. I also exploited a novel written by Alice Milligan entitled A Royal Democrat. Now, this was published by Milligan under her own name in 1890. And I also studied or examined a story called The Professor in Erin, serialized in Sinn Féin Weekly in 1912 and written by L. McManus, a nom de plume for Charlotte Elizabeth McManus. And this was republished in book form in 1918. In my corpus, there's a 4th book entitled 1895 Under Home Rule, which was assumed by the Cork Constitution to be the production of a County Cork lady, but I wasn't able to find any further evidence of that. So I will not be speaking of this one. For this presentation, I'm going to focus especially on Gregory's work as well as Milligan's novel, because they are more deeply connected to home rule than The Professor in Erin. The Professor in Erin is indeed not so much a fiction promoting home rule or criticizing it. Instead, it's visibly imbued by the ideals promoted by Douglas Hyde and Arthur Griffith. So it promotes de-Anglicization as a way to reclaim Ireland's true national identity. It promotes self-sufficiency. It hopes for Ireland to become Gaelic, non-sectarian, as well as an independent monarchy. McManus was originally from a unionist background, like Lady Gregory and Alice Milligan, but she published The Professor in Erin in different circumstances. It came out in 1912, that is to say almost 20 years after her conversion to nationalism, which she situates around 1894. And following that conversion, McManus became an activist for the Gaelic League in Ireland. She became acquainted with Douglas Hyde and other people associated with radical nationalism. So I would consider her as part of the women who ended up involved in radical organizations, advanced nationalist circles. So that's why I'm excluding her from this presentation. And that's why I'm focusing rather on Gregory's story and Milligan's novel. So I will start with the Phantom's Pilgrimage, summing up the story first and then analyzing it more. The Phantom's Pilgrimage opens on the Egyptian ritual of the weighing of the heart, and William Gladstone, now deceased and a ghost, is allowed one day back on Earth to obtain proof that he has done good during his lifetime and deserves eternal life. Now, he's required to choose one great deed proving his worth, and he decides to verify whether Home Rule, which he granted to Ireland, has produced the prosperity and happiness he had guaranteed. So as a ghost, he visits different places, a cottage in the Irish countryside, a small Irish town, Dublin and its new parliament on College Green, a landlord's estate, and a priest's house. But everywhere he goes, he's confronted to misery, starvation, discontent, and chaos. So he fails in his mission, obviously. So this is clearly unionist or anti-home rule. For instance, the famished peasants, the ghost comes across, all curse home rule and them that gave it to us. And the narrative more broadly reflects some of the typical unionist fears of the time. The landlords have gone or have been forced to leave due to overtaxation and ruin. That tenants remain overburdened with taxes and poverty. The towns are no better than the countryside. They are poor and miserable. Self-ruling Ireland is even a military threat against England, since volunteers depart to help the Russians against the English in Asia. In Dublin, College Green is the site of a riot, opposing an angry mob to the new rulers, so that the country looks on the brink of a revolution, as you can tell from the last quote on the slide. And there are further disturbances described in the novel, including at the end, the murder of a Catholic priest by a group of cattle maimers and moonlighters. So the whole story is clearly dystopian and reactivates some of the great cliches used by the unionists. For instance, the idea that the Irish would be incapable of governing themselves according to the rule of law, or secondly, the idea that the Irish were prone to violence and extremism, so that Ireland, once independent, Ireland would fall prey to crime and anarchy. Now, this is all interesting because Lady Gregory is associated to Irish nationalism and to the Celtic revival. She's associated to figures like Yeats and Hyde. But as I said earlier, the Phantom's Pilgrimage was part of her early writings and was produced before she met Yeats. At the same time, you're very well aware that she was part of the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy. And in actual fact, between 1880 and 1892, she had been married to William Gregory, a landlord and politician notorious for introducing the quarter-acre clause during the Great Irish Famine, and a conservative and unionist himself. As a conservative and unionist, William Gregory had been hostile to the land war, but at the same time, he was also deeply aware of the failures of his own class, and he was aware that this was a class facing an impending decline. Now, Augusta Gregory initially shared her husband's views. She was alarmed at the policies adopted by Gladstone because she felt that they threatened her interests as an Irish Protestant and as a member of the landed class herself. But by that stage, she also had started her education in politics, the education in politics that was to lead her to embrace nationalism. In 1883, she had had a brief affair with Wilfrid Scaven Blunt, a sympathizer of the Irish cause and of the Egyptian Rising of 1881 and 1882. She had also started to read nationalist authors and pamphlets concerned with the history of Ireland and its struggle for freedom. And she had even sided with Parnell against Gladstone during the 1890 split. So because it was published in 1893 and during a period when Gregory was moving from unionism to nationalism, A Phantom's Pilgrimage has been regarded as part of a body of early writings, which may be read as crucial works of transition in Gregory's literary and political development. I'm relying here on the analysis provided by James Pethica, who edited these early writings, as you can see. Pethica considers that these works, and therefore A Phantom's Pilgrimage, show Gregory responding specifically and acutely to the changing political conditions in Ireland, starting to discover the subject matter central to her later career and reflecting self-consciously on both her own circumstances and her creative capacities, all long before her acknowledged emergence as a professed Irish nationalist. So like other writings of the same period, A Phantom's Pilgrimage betrays a form of conservative nationalism or divided loyalty. Lady Gregory was still nominally a unionist in 1893 when she published anonymously this story. Yet she displays sympathy for the rural people whose plight under Home Rule is described with much pathos, as you can tell from the last quote on the slide. And at the same time, in the story, the landlord and his family, the landlord that Gladstone Ghosts ends up meeting, and his family are ostracized by the rural community surrounding them. And that reveals Gregory's deep anxieties as a member of the Protestant ascendancy. We sense her fear of losing not merely her own estate, but maybe her connection to Ireland and its rural people. I'm going to move on to the second fiction written by a woman, and that's The Royal Democrat, published by Milligan in 1890, so 3 years prior to The Phantom's Pilgrimage. Once again, I'll sum up the plot and then move on to an analysis of the book. So in A Royal Democrat, the story is set in 1939. Ireland is still ruled by the English crown. There has been a failed armed insurrection against Britain, 2 unsuccessful Home Rule bills, and this has left the island devastated and bubbling with discontent. Measures to reinforce the union have been introduced, as well as ruthless coercion, but defiance still runs high, and the Irish people seem to be waiting for some kind of messiah to deliver them from English tyranny. The central character of the novel is the future king of the United Kingdom, or Prince of Wales, Arthur Cormac Christian Frederick. He's a young man with Irish ancestry, but is also conflicted about his future role as monarch, since he confesses to Republican sympathies. During a tour of the colonies, he learns of his father's death, and so he returns to England, but he ends up shipwrecked on the coast of Donegal on his way back. He's reported dead, so the throne goes to his cousin, Princess Frederica. From that point onwards, Prince Arthur begins a new life in Ireland under a new name, the name of Cormac King. And as Cormac King, he bonds with Irish peasants and nationalist sympathizers in Donegal first, and then in Dublin. He tries to advise them and lead them while keeping his true identity hidden from them, obviously. And Nationalist Ireland is, at that point, the Nationalist Ireland portrayed by Milligan is divided between 2 sides: the supporters of constitutional action, gathered in an association known as the Liberation League, and the proponents of physical force known as the Sunburst Boys. Now, Cormac tries to navigate through the complexities of Irish politics, first in Donegal, then in Dublin. Unrest is on the rise. When unrest is on the rise, he travels back to Donegal with one of his new Dublin friends, and together they try to rally the Sunburst Boys. They manage to rally the Sunburst Boys to a plan of campaign, and this plan of campaign is destined to free Ireland from oppression. Now, the idea is to organize systematic cattle raids targeting Scottish and English planters that have been settled on evicted properties. These tactics lead to confrontations with the British Army, during which both Cormac King and his friend are made prisoners and sent to London to be tried. They're eventually pardoned once the Queen is made aware that one of the prisoners is her cousin. And at the end, Cormac King renounces to take back his crown, opting to live in Ireland instead and marry his love interest, his Irish love interest. Of course, there's a love story. Nola Shane. The plan of campaign bears fruit because an entirely new policy for Ireland is devised. A Home Rule Bill is voted in 1948, and an Irish Parliament is opened by the Queen the following year. So what we have here is A Plea for Home Rule, a novel pleading, advocating for Home Rule. And again, that's interesting because Milligan is now recognized as one of the rare female figureheads of nationalism in Ulster, an influential contributor to the Irish revival. She's rather associated to republicanism or advanced nationalism for several reasons. Her role as editor of the Shanbannbord between 1896 and 99, her acquaintance with radical figures such as Maud Gonne, Michael Davitt, Arthur Griffith, James Connolly, her participation to the commemoration of the 1798 rebellion. However, Milligan was not born a nationalist. She was raised in an Irish Methodist family from Ulster, committed to the Union, and she does acknowledge that in her diary. She describes her background as strictly Tory and Protestant. She also says that her education initially taught her nothing of Ireland. So she was not destined to become a nationalist and a nationalist activist. Like Lady Gregory, she converted to nationalism, and her diary reveals that this conversion can be traced back to late May, early June 1891, when Milligan was actually in Dublin. She arrived in Dublin in 1890, and while in Dublin, she became a supporter of Parnell. And following his death, and the death of Parnell a few months after her arrival to Dublin, so that was Parnell died in October 1890, as you know. Parnell's death actually reinforced her commitment to the Parnellite cause. In July 1892, she still identified as a staunch nationalist, as a Parnellite, and she longed for the return of Thomas Sexton, for instance, as MP for West Belfast. So that so 2 years after this conversion to Parnellism, she still defined herself as a Parnellite. Now, a Royal Democrat has been analysed by a couple of scholars, Jean McNulty and Catherine Morris, and it's been interpreted diversely by these two scholars. Morris, for instance, sees the book as, I quote, an apologia for English monarchical rule in the form of a heroic romance of cultural unification. According to Morris, the main protagonist, Cormac King, embodies a paternalistic approach to Anglo-Irish relationships. He promotes a conservative agenda because he rejects radical activism and violence, and he strives to preserve the Anglo-Irish bond. However, for Morris, Milligan's narrative is also influenced by nationalist ideas. England's forced domination of Ireland is depicted as a source of depopulation, immigration, evictions, and misery. Even renewed colonization through the means of plantations. Morris also deems the novel futuristic. She considers that it announces events that were to take place after its publication, notably the setting up of an Irish Republic in 1949, or the adoption by Sinn Féin and Arthur Griffith of this idea of a dual monarchy system as a solution to the Irish question. Now, to me, this is a point, or this is an interpretation I would challenge because it reads too much like a retrospective interpretation of the work, I think. And instead, I would suggest that, as in the case of the Phantom's Pilgrimage by Lady Gregory, a Royal Democrat can be read as a form of transitional work, showing Milligan gradually moving away from the unionism she was raised into. Let's remember that Royal Democrat was published in 1890. So either during or just before the conversion to Parnellism. This was not the first book by Milligan. In 1888, she had published a book with her father called Glimpses of Erin. But this book, according to Morris, this book did not really challenge unionist views. It targeted an English readership, and it avoided political controversy. It was descriptive accounts of the Northern Territories of Ireland. By contrast, A Royal Democrat was written single-handedly by Milligan, published under her own name, and it's much more political, as you could already tell with the summary I gave you. The content of the novel actually betrays this political awakening and its evolution from unionist to Parnellite. Milligan did not straight away become a radical nationalist. She first transitioned and she was first a Parnellite before maybe moving to a more radical form of nationalism. And we see that very clearly from a number of things in the novel. Ireland is still under English rule, but Irish MPs remain present as Westminster as members of a new National Party, following the strategies used by Parnell himself in the late 70s and early 80s, obstruction notably. The leader of this new party is a mix between Parnell and Davitt. So he condemns English capitalists, but he's also committed to constitutional methods. He's opposed to violence. The choice of constitutional strategies is praised in the novel, validated notably by the main female character, Nola Shane, who regards this choice as entirely rightful in order to bring about a settlement of the Irish question. The book does contain several passages questioning the relevance of the monarchical system. Some of its characters do cherish the hope of a new rebellion in Ireland. However, the novel also rejects the prospect of total separation and the use of physical force. Rebellions are described as used as sacrifices, for instance. As Morris noted, and rightfully so, Cormac King stresses the centrality of the Union and strives to see it preserved. His friend Kildare Davoren is more receptive to the ideals of extreme nationalism, but he's a foil character in the narrative, allowing Cormac to preach reconciliation between England and Ireland. Last but not least, at the end of the novel, in a chapter tellingly entitled The Dawn of Freedom, Ireland obtains home rule. It's granted its own parliament, but it remains submitted to the British Crown, all in keeping with the schemes that were defended up to 1890. Home rule is presented as a rebirth, allowing Ireland to be rebuilt as a prosperous and peaceful country and as a budding democracy where new parties can emerge and debate peacefully. In the last lines, the book evokes the possibility that violence and divisions might persist despite self-government. Yet Milligan concludes with a statement betraying maybe a wish for self-rule to be a lasting settlement. Ireland suffered much, she says. Let us hope that her trials will be followed by peace and happiness. So I'm still going to continue with fiction, but this time focusing on fiction written by men. And I'm going to present two of those. A novel, a 3-volume novel and romance published by John Francis Maguire in 1871 and entitled The Next Generation. And a second novel called Anno Domini 2000, A Women's Destiny, published in 1889 by Julius Vogel, who was a prominent New Zealand politician. These two narratives share a specificity. They deal not only with home rule, but they also tackle the theme of women's rights. This is obvious considering the title chosen by Julius Vogel. It's less immediately obvious with Maguire's novel. However, that novel has been referenced by a literary scholar as a satire, largely on women in politics, set in 1891 and 92. So that interestingly suggests that the focus of the book is actually the women's issue rather than Irish politics, even though Maguire was an Irish politician. In The Next Generation, Maguire pleads for home rule. He envisages a federal union. Ireland is run by a home government. Ireland and Britain are at peace because they end up united in sympathy and interests. The relationship with the Crown is improved. And the granting of home rule leads Ireland to experience a rebirth. Ireland is transformed, with agrarian tensions diminishing. Famine no longer exists. The living conditions of tenants are improved. Landlord and tenants get on well. The industry is booming. There's better, the economy is better, and therefore there's also better education provided to children. And last but not least, tensions between Catholics and Protestants have disappeared. So Ireland is transformed into a paradise upon earth, a new Arcadia, and this is attributed to the granting of self-rule to Ireland. In the same novel, Maguire also imagines a new Britain, where women can be members of government, can be whips, parliamentary representatives. They also have dedicated political clubs. They may receive an education and work, and they show skills in fields as varied as the law, literature, journalism, science, nursing, or medicine. Women have invaded the public realm, and they have done so successfully. Women's capacities to work in the medical field, for instance, are recognized. They are naturally qualified for the profession because they possess qualities unmatched by men: patience, tenderness, delicacy, quickness and keenness of observation, untiring assiduity. The novel contains recurrent celebrations of women in the public sphere, and that conveys the impression that the novel is also a plea for women's emancipation. And you have a quote giving you an example of Maguire's praise of women in the novel. This novel is deeply and clearly inspired by the historical context in which it was produced. It was published in 1871, so only a mere year after the creation of the Home Government Association by Isaac Butt. And Maguire, originally a Liberal MP, joined the association shortly after its launching. The Next Generation was also published only a few years after the presentation of a petition advocating for the female franchise in 1866, and after the introduction of an amendment to the 1867 Reform Bill requesting to replace the word man by person. The first ever women's suffrage bill had also passed its second reading in May 1870. Discussions were postponed for the following 6 months. The same bill was reintroduced in 1871. In May 1871, it was passed but shelved, and Maguire voted for that bill. All of these efforts were the culmination of a movement born in the 50s and 60s, which campaigned not only for the vote for women, but for a wider access to the public sphere for women, modifications to the marriage laws, and the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Women had also faced new educational and professional opportunities, and legislative reforms had been obtained, such as the granting of the municipal franchise for single female ratepayers, the right for women to be elected as poor law guardians in 1969. There had also been a reform of the rights to property for married women in 1870. So the Next Generation was produced in a context where agitation for Home Rule in Ireland coincided with a rising interest in the issue of women's rights. Anno Domini by Vogel shares some characteristics with the Next Generation, despite being published later, 1889. First, it pleads for Home Rule, albeit slightly differently. Anno Domini is first and foremost an advocacy for imperial federation. And it sees Home Rule as linked to this question of imperial federation. Ireland is granted Home Rule thanks to pressure put on the British government by the white settlement colonies. And it is because Ireland obtained self-government that the empire is federated along stronger lines. So when Ireland is granted Home Rule, the empire is already a federation, but the fact that Ireland obtains Home Rule allows this federation to become stronger. As the subtitle conveys, Anno Domini is also a novel dealing with women's emancipation and advocating greater rights for them. It's not surprising because Vogel, as I said, Vogel originally was a politician in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, he was the man who had introduced the first women's suffrage bill to the New Zealand Parliament in 1887. He published Anno Domini 2 years later after returning to the UK. And as the book shows, the story was designed so as to show that a recognized dominance of either sex is unnecessary, and that each member of either sex should enjoy the position to which he or she is entitled by reason of his or her qualifications. The story depicts a future where universal suffrage and eligibility for all above 18 have been established. The main female character, Hilda Richmond Fitzherbert, clearly a woman with Irish roots, is a member of the Federal Imperial Parliament. She's also the Under Secretary of State for Home Affairs, and she rises up the social scale since she's first Countess and Duchess of New Zealand, and eventually she ends up marrying the British Emperor himself. Other women in the novel occupy other important positions of power. The President of the United States, for instance, is a woman, which has never happened yet. As in the next generation, women are not only involved in politics, but also in scientific and economic ventures, and as such, they contribute to the progress of the British Empire and to its might. So once again, empowered and emancipated women occupy center stage, which is why one of the rare scholarly papers on the novel asserts that it offers a unique feminist perspective at a time when female characters were a rarity in science fiction. Once again, this is in keeping with the context in which the novel was produced. By the time of the publication of Anno Domini, the issue of women's rights and of the female suffrage had not abated. In Britain, an amendment proposing to include women in the Third Reform Bill of 1884 had been introduced, yet without success. Women's involvement in central and local politics was promoted by new organizations and was on the rise. And as for the home rule question, it had been at the forefront of politics in 1885, 1886, as I'm sure you know. The two novels are particularly interesting for me and for us, maybe, because of the way they mingle the two topics in a single narrative each time, the questions of Ireland's independence and the questions of women's emancipation on the other, suggesting perhaps that there were two sides of the same coin, if I may say so. Now, I'm aware that those who supported Irish Home Rule were certainly not all in favor of granting women the vote or involving them in politics. Conversely, not all suffragists, whether male or female, advocated Home Rule for Ireland. The fact that the Home Rule movement and the debate on the female franchise were discussed at the same time may be regarded as a mere coincidence of date. However, several scholars suggest possible connections between the quest for the emancipation of women and that for the emancipation of Ireland. For instance, Martin Pugh claims that Victorian feminists focused on the issue of the vote because of what access to the franchise had allowed other groups to achieve. The significance attributed to the vote was heightened by the examples set by other contemporary radical movements. And the Home Rule movement and the labor movement in particular had, according to him, a galvanizing effect on the mid and late 19th century suffragists. Pugh admits that constitutional reform was displaced in public debate by the union with Ireland, and also by perceived threat to the empire, so by the imperial question. But he also postulates that imperial crises sometimes push women into prominence and involve them more closely in national and imperial issues. Senia Paseta concurs that there were many links between the Home Rule movement and the women's movement. She argues that the women's movement was shaped in fundamental ways by the Irish question, as it interacted with, influenced, and was influenced by the main political questions of the day. In her view, one common point between the two struggles was that they both aimed to challenge the British Constitution in radical ways and to expand the category of citizenship. This is in keeping with Eugenio Bergini's view, according to which the Irish issue forced liberal politics to go through a period of rapid transformation and a redefinition of the very meaning of liberty, of the concept or notion of liberty. For Biagini, Home Rule became indissociable from humanitarianism and was part of the broader debate on imperialism, liberty, and democracy, which was so important in the UK during the late Victorian and Edwardian period. And this is also a theory which has been advocated by James Doherty with a focus on the third Home Rule crisis. So when such a broad view of Home Rule is taken, then one understands better why it may have been perceived as a battle that was comparable to and could be correlated with other struggles for emancipation, notably the struggle in favor of women's emancipation. Now, I had planned to spend a bit of time evoking female characters in these future fictions, but I'm afraid the presentation is going to be maybe a bit too long, so I'm going to skip that. What I wanted to show was that the empowerment shown in the next generation, Anno Domini, and even a royal democrat by Milligan, is relative. They're still trapped they're still trapped, or they're still victims of all the stereotypes and cliches that were linked to women during the Victorian period. And even Milligan is fairly ambivalent. The female character she includes in the novel dreams of emancipation, dreams of being more active in politics, but at the same time, there's still a division of the two spheres, the public and the private, as you can tell from the code. But I need to move on, so I'm happy to come back to that if you're curious. Now, so far, I've limited myself to a specific subgenre of fiction and to a few examples of that type of fiction, future fictions. I hope it was sufficient to show the potential literary sources offer for investigating the connection between women and home rule, but obviously other fictional works should be taken into account if the matter was to be, if this question of women and home rule was to be explored further, especially because recent scholarship has emphasized how female writers became more prominent from the last quarter of the 19th century onwards, and how these female writers use fiction to express and disseminate political views. So I need to broaden if I was to do more work on this, I would need to broaden the corpus. I've got a few ideas, as you can see, of how to do this, but I haven't yet started. Now, fiction may be one solution for the historian to broaden the scope of his or her investigation, and using it helps us respond to Malcolm Brown's critique back in 1972 when he deplored that, unfortunately, the monographs published by Irish historians are oriented almost exclusively towards parliamentary history, with an occasional side expedition into episodes of clerical intrigue. However, let us also keep in mind the words of the French historian Lucien Febvre, who a lot earlier than Brown encouraged his fellow historians to look beyond the traditional sources of history, especially the written sources. I'm going to read a bit of French here. Hopefully you can understand. L'histoire se fait avec des documents écrits, sans doute, quand il y en a. Mais elle peut se faire, elle doit se faire avec tout ce que l'ingéniosité de l'historien peut lui permettre d'utiliser. Donc avec des mots, des signes, des paysages et des tuiles, des formes de champs et de mauvaises herbes, des éclipses de lune et des colliers d'attelage. It's a very beautiful, I don't know if you understood, but it's a very beautiful quote in which Febvre encourages us historians to use not only written sources, but also images, objects, landscapes. And his beautiful words provide me with a wonderful transition to the field of illustrations and images, which I would like to evoke to discuss further this issue of women and home rule. Now, Peter chose an image to promote this talk, this paper. And in this image, as you may have noticed, and this image shows us that one woman in particular featured prominently in the imagery produced in relation to home rule, especially in the illustrated press. I assume this is this is from the press. And that woman is Erin, the allegory of Ireland, who was represented in different postures, monumental, enchained, empowered, courting, ambiguous, as Lionel Perry Curtis has pointed out. We could add to the list as a housewife as well. That's what the picture shows us. Now, this figure of Erin has been a subject discussed to some extent in the scholarly literature, so that's why I decided to focus on another type of visual material, a less known type of visual material maybe, and that's the picture postcards. Now, picture postcards are a valuable source because they are both images and objects. As you can tell also with the figures at the top of the slide, they had become an extremely popular medium of communication, especially in the early 20th century. A spectacular number of postcards was distributed in the UK alone, in Ireland as well. Postcards targeted all social classes and both genders. They could be seen in shops. They were sent, received, also collected. And consequently, their imagery communicated ideas and values to a wide audience, probably considerably wider than the audience for other mass media, for other mass media of the period. Because of that very wide audience, postcards were soon enough used as an extra propaganda device. And their specificity was that they were received by unsuspecting recipients who were bombarded with political messages without the possibility to block or control them, a bit like the social media today, maybe. Because postcards relied on simple pictures, bright colors, and catchy slogans, they contributed to make political issues and topics, such as home rule, easily digestible. Now, discovering this rather unexplored field of home rule postcards has led me to come across specific items, which I think are relevant to the topic under discussion today. These postcards I'm going to show you were produced in the 1910s, that is to say, at a time when the question of women's rights, notably the vote, was prominent, but so was the home rule issue. And once again, the two issues, there's a coincidence in terms of dates or timeframes. So it was not unusual as a result for some of these postcards to mix both topics, blurring the boundaries between them, and at the same time blurring the boundaries between public and private, a boundary that still marked women's and men's lives in those days. Often, as you can see, this was done in a humorous way, especially as the word home rule could be understood as referring to the private sphere or to the fate of Ireland. I'm showing you 4 examples here, with a first postcard on the left in black and white issued by Lawrence of Dublin, where we see a man washing clothes, while the women around him have become the masters of the house. The older woman in the center reads a newspaper showing her emancipation. Yet at the same time, she's surrounded by 2 other women who seem to argue between themselves so that the peace of the house is clearly disrupted. And this is a postcard poking fun at the disruption of the domestic sphere that would be caused by the emancipation of women. The postcard in the center, as well as at the top, were both produced by Donald McGill, a famous postcard artist who produced an estimated 10,000 designs in about 50 years. And he's known to have produced at least 6 cards related or connected to the topic of home rule, and you have 2 of those in front of you. And then there was this last postcard at the bottom here, which I did find on eBay. I bought it, and it's currently on its way, but I haven't been able to bring it with me. I have this one with me, the one that you have on the left. So clearly the focus in these 4 postcards is the question of women's emancipation. In 3 of them, what is evoked is the danger that this emancipation might represent, as it is likely to upset social order, since more power to women is understood as questioning the role and status of men and maybe modifying the boundaries between the public and private spheres. Talking about the postcards produced by McGill, Declan Martin, who's one of the rare scholars to have published work on postcards. So Declan Martin presents these postcards as more humorous than political. But to me, I mean, I clearly see why these postcards are filled with humor, but I also find them deeply political, conveying messages that buyers and recipients could identify with, either in relation to the home rule question, Ireland's freedom, or in relation to women's rights, another deeply political question. It's particularly clear with the second postcard here, where home rule is printed in green, and where you have a young woman evoking the possibility for women to get the vote once a parliament in Dublin is restored. Interestingly, the color green is used in the 4th postcard together with shamrocks, which was typical of the nationalist imagery. And yet we also see a pan, if I'm not mistaken. and a bunch of irons, so domestic appliances, reminding us of the domestic sphere, and therefore related to the topic of women's emancipation or absence of emancipation. So we have postcards here playing on the figure of the double entendre, and as in the novels by Vogel and Maguire, they deal with the notion of empowerment, both in relation to Ireland and in relation to women. Now, they were produced when both topics dominated politics, as I highlighted earlier, so it makes sense for the two topics to be combined. All the more so as one of the questions that home rulers did face in the 1910s was indeed the fate they envisaged for women in a self-governing Ireland. Now, another group of postcards I wanted to show, also produced in the 1910s in relation to the Home Rule question, were these cat postcards. When I started working on Irish nationalism and Home Rule, I never imagined I would come across this and I would be able to talk about cats in relation to Irish politics. I'm a cat. I mean, I like cats. I know Peter does as well, so it's a way also of thanking him for inviting me. So I wanted to include this section on cat postcards for Peter's sake as well. Now, they're not a joke. I have two examples in my possession, one used with a stamp and a date. And I've come across other images of the same sort in my research online. And I think more of these were produced. So it was not unusual for cats to be used and represented in art by that stage. It was not unusual for cats to appear in postcards either. But these particular postcards I find extremely weird or extremely strange, a bit creepy too. And they raise questions for me. They raise questions as to who was intended to buy them, who are they designed for? I mean, who was meant to receive them? As you can see, they're visually fairly similar with small variations as to the position of the cat or some of the accessories included in the postcards, the piece of wood or the crown. What differs the most is the message written on the postcards, and we see messages that can either support home rule or defend a unionist point of view, I think. So the fact that we have the same sort of imagery to promote different political messages emphasizes the role these postcards had as commercial objects. A further suggestion I'd like to submit is that all these postcards likely targeted female buyers or were intended rather for female recipients. I think maybe more women than men. Now, I'm taking a bit of a risk, and I think it's hard to prove unless you're able to examine used postcards, and those are difficult to come across. So far I only have two items. I have this one postcard in my possession, which was used, and it's difficult to read who signed it, but we can see that it was addressed to a woman, Mrs. Dalzell in Cumberland. As far as I know, I mean, I did a bit of digging on the catalogues of libraries, notably the National Library of Ireland, but I didn't come across cat postcards related to home rule. The only cat postcard I came across has nothing to do with home rule, as you can see. It's a good luck card. But what's interesting about it is that it's part of the Margaret Pierce papers, and it's annotated by Margaret Pierce, so maybe confirming that those cards were intended for women rather than men. Another thing that may confirm this, that may further confirm this idea I have, is that postcards of the same nature were produced to express views for or against the suffragettes. I've reproduced here 4 examples of those, relying on an online archive, the Anne Lewis Women's Suffrage Collection. So you have 4 items here. The time frame ranges from 1905 to 1913. So, well, we have cats once more as central figures, dressed up as suffragettes. And in two cases, the green, white, and purple stripes, so the colors used by the suffragette movement. Cats were cats were used more extensively by as so cats were used more extensively for propaganda purposes, as you can tell with this next slide. They were used as ceramic figurines, they were used on lighters, silver boxes, and what's interesting is to see the same pictures reappearing. So a profusion, we have this profusion of cats in relation to the suffragette movements. Now, the curators of another online exhibition by Johns Hopkins University on votes and on the women's suffrage, an exhibition entitled "Votes and Petticoats." Those curators explain the use of the cat figures as follows. They state, postcard manufacturers hired artists to create visually appealing postcards about women's suffrage. A popular subject was the suffrage cat, which was used for both pro and anti-suffrage messaging. In Victorian culture, the cat was often associated with the female sphere. The indoor cat represented the passive, ideal homemaker, and the outdoor cat was brazen, feral, and fallen. Those curators add that defining how the cat was intended to be viewed as a symbol can be a challenge. And indeed, the challenge does appear obvious when we see that these cats were reused by publishers, but in completely different contexts. And I have one example on the right here, the same kitten as before, but with a different message. I want my map. So that makes it more confusing for us as to, who was to buy. I mean, that makes the whole story a lot more confusing. And once again, it would be useful to try and better establish who was meant to buy who was meant to buy these postcards, who was meant to receive them, so as to better understand the type of markets that the publishers targeted. Now, in these online collections, you have sometimes these online collections reproduce used items. So we have indications as to what was written on the backgrounds of the postcards. And in a number of instances, we do have women senders and women recipients. So it tends to corroborate this idea that those kind of cards targeted women rather than men. And so as a result, I would be able to apply that to my home rule cats. Now, obviously, a project such as working on women and home rule would entail looking into far more primary documents and also looking into far more examples of women themselves. I'm very well aware that it would involve using the press, as well as private papers such as letters and diaries. Letters and diaries would be especially useful, I think, to investigate or reinvestigate the case of women that were intimately close to some of the leaders of the Irish Parliamentary Party. I'm thinking of the women that surrounded Parnell, Anna and Fanny, and his mother Delia, or even Kitty O'Shea. But I'm thinking also of women such as Elizabeth Matthew, John Dillon's wife, or Sophie Rafalovich O'Brien, Williams O'Brien's wife. Strangely enough, an edited version, a condensed version of the diaries of Elizabeth Matthew was published in 2019. But as far as I know, it hasn't been the object of any scholarly work. And yet, this diary is described in one review as a valuable source because it's chiefly about the coming of age of an intelligent, serious-minded, and intellectually inquisitive girl who progressively discovered her identity as a patriotic Irish woman, making the acquaintance of many members of the Irish Party. Sophie Rafalovich left us a lot of letters held by the National Library of Ireland. There's also an unpublished manuscript entitled Memoirs by Sophie O'Brien of a number of Irish political and literary figures of the early 20th century. And then she published a book entitled My Irish Friends in 1937. So these could be useful to shed light on her role, her opinions on home rule politics or the home rule issue. And all the more so, Anne O'Brien herself is described in the Irish Dictionary, in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, as an activist whose marriage to William O'Brien led her to be rapidly absorbed into the informal female social networks surrounding the Irish Party. And Sophie was particularly useful to William O'Brien, helping him in his political activities and in his political work. So those are sources I'm also going to try and look into. But as I have pointed out, I'm just at the beginning. I'm just in the early stages of new work, so I'm going to leave it there. And thank you for attention. And I'm looking forward to your questions and advice.
Marvelous, Pauline. Thank you so much for such a wide-ranging paper, introducing us to some really new themes in research, iconography of political cats.
Yes.
New work to me as well. Let's throw it open for questions. Obviously, people in the room can just raise their hands. People online, if you want to digitally raise your hand or type a question into the comments box, Luke will let us know if you want to ask a question. Let's start at the back, yes, please.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk. I just want to know how nationalism can be placed in culture in a wider context. So I was kind of curious to know the plays and music supporting these kind of ideas as well you're talking about. And the other question I had is, you mentioned Lady Gregory and Alice Milligan. How much of an act of rebellion are they engaged in? Are they still going to Protestant churches in Dublin, and are they kind of remove themselves from their religion? Is it an act of rebellion against is it a blow for emancipation against men? Is the feminist agenda? I think you could I think that's something that you could explore a lot more. I think possibly, yeah. So it's basically nationalism is kind of cultural, ethnic, religion. It's all that and more. And yeah, I just wanted were they still going to Protestant churches, or they stopped all that?
I don't. I mean, there's definitely a cultural dimension to nationalism, especially in the Irish context. I mean, in the corpus I studied, so the corpus I studied included short stories and novels, but it also included poems and plays. In relation to the specific topic of women and home rule, I haven't yet done enough research to be able to tell you whether there were specific poems, or you mentioned songs and ballads, and that's another type of sources that can be used, obviously. But I haven't done enough research to be able to answer further. So I focus on politics and on the political awakening of Milligan and Lady Gregory. I'm not so familiar with their connection to religion and to Protestantism. I mean, they were both Protestant, but I don't know how they felt about, religion or Protestantism. I think so. Once again, I'm going to fail in my answer. That I know Milligan left diaries, so maybe the diary would be those diaries or that diary would be a useful source to know if she still attended church or how she felt about religion and about Protestantism. As far as, was she a feminist? I think she not only became a militant nationalist, but I'd say she also became, to use a modern or contemporary word, a feminist too. However, this is not so, I haven't read what she wrote after the Royal Democrats, so I would have to look at that maybe to see how she evolved on these questions, both the women's issue and Ireland's fate as a nation. So I can go back on what I failed to present earlier, because in that novel, so that novel, she published that novel early on in her career. And in that novel, to me, she's still, I mean, if we assume this female, so what the quote I've got here on the right-hand side is a quote reflecting the thoughts of the main female character in the novel, Nola Shane. And Nola Shane is the love interest of the two male characters, the two male heroes, Cormac King and Kilda Warren. She deeply influences both of them, so she has power over them. Because she has that power and influence, then the whole question of women's emancipation and women's political role is tackled in the novel with this one quote reflecting how Nola Shane feels about this. So she looks with newborn hope to the future, believing that life may be far more joyous than she deemed possible when a short year ago she had looked out from a school prison to the narrowing horizon that then seemed the utmost boundary of a woman's sphere. She had then sorrowed because she was not a man, because she fancied that it was useless to have high ideals when she was powerless to act. She is content now, knowing that a woman may, without stepping from the proper sphere, exert an influence all powerful for good. And Nola, for the first time, tasted the sweets of that power. It's an interesting quote, especially if we assume that Nola Shane represents the type of activist that Milligan wanted to become, or that Milligan wanted women to become, because clearly she dreams of emancipation. She has received education, but school is regarded, school was a prison. She aspired to be like a man, but then there's a shift to the present, and the idea that she's content now, knowing that a woman can be influential without stepping outside the proper sphere, that is to say, the private sphere or the domestic sphere. So it's a relative, she dreams of emancipation, but maybe a relative form of emancipation. And I think that's interesting if we assume that this character represents maybe some of Milligan's thoughts on the involvement of women in politics at that point in her life. Now, maybe in later years, she became more militant or she became more radical. I would have to investigate that further.
Sure.
Oh, great.
Hello.
Thanks. Just a suggestion about kind of sources. Maybe you look much at Irish women outside Ireland, talking about like immigrant letters, for example, fundraising in America, or very extensive Irish American press, to get a sense of to what extent there might be some influence by women.
Yes, thank you for the suggestion. I thought about this. I mean, I've always been interested in looking at this homo issue using different scales. So Ireland, I also consider it as a British problem, and I've also done work on the Empire and Ireland and how there was mobilization in some of the white settlement colonies, in particular, in favor of homo or against it too. And so, I mean, I know that if I was to, investigate, I mean, if I was to explore this further and to be faithful to that exploration, I would have to look at how women outside of Ireland, especially in the Empire, became involved, how they supported or not homo, and using the press. I've used the press before. This is a major work, so I think I would have to focus on case studies maybe and see how, when there were tours, for instance, how women mobilized and how the press maybe gives us clues as to that. So that's an idea I have as well.
You're thinking of the digitization of press and immigrant letters. It's like changing so rapidly.
Yes, it helps a lot. Now, I haven't done anything with immigrant letters. I know other scholars have, and you had a presentation, I think, using that kind of material. I've done more work on the press, and yes, there's papers passed for New Zealand. I think It's easy to access Australian papers. I'm not so sure about Canadian and American papers because I've done less work on that, but yes, definitely. Thank you.
Yes, Dan.
Thanks, Pauline. That was brilliant. I'm a cat lover too, so that was ticking boxes all over the place for me. Thinking about your female authors that you've found so far, do they offer any justification for using pseudonyms or writing anonymously?
Do they themselves offer? I haven't come across any information allowing us. I mean, any information on that. So once again, I think that. I think Gregory published anonymously because she was, she had lost her husband only the year before. She was still, she was in between unionism and nationalism. So maybe that was, I think as far as I can remember, the story was first circulated to relatives or friends before it was published. But when it was published, it was not done under her name. And she was in the early stages also of a literary career, so maybe not confident enough. Does she offer any justification? I don't know. I don't know if she left letters or diaries that would tell us more, maybe. And same thing for Milligan. Now, Milligan was braver, and maybe the diaries would shed light on that. So yeah, for me, it's interesting that she, the first book she published with her father. So she was just the co-author. And then 2 years later, she's in Dublin. She's no longer in Belfast. So maybe that helped also, taking that step to publish under her own name. But yeah, I think to answer that kind of question, you'd have to look at maybe letters or diaries if they have anything on that.
Look, anything online?
Yeah, we have one hand raised. If Guy, you want to unmute.
Hello.
Hello. I really enjoyed that, Pauline.
Thank you.
Particularly the postcards. The postcards were brilliant, really. I mean, even seeing Donald McGill, the young Donald McGill, because later on he makes all these risque postcards after the war. It's interesting to see what he does with the cats. I'm not sure about, but we'll see what you do with that. And you'll have to think about things that are sources that are created by women, for women, and about women. I mean, those categories you're going to have to play with in interesting ways. But I want to bring you back to fiction, where you began. And even there was interesting. It was interesting to see you speak about Julius Vogel, because that book first came to my attention in 2000 when it was reprinted. It was marketed as the utopian novel that got the future right, and it's kind of bizarre because he's a Jewish English Prime Minister of New Zealand, and the reason he chooses Ireland is not quite clear. The whole thing is strange, but I'm wondering if you delve into fiction more, if maybe you shouldn't pursue the line that you've already taken in your previous book of future fiction, and it might be more promising to take what might seem slightly more traditional but interesting as well, looking at past fiction, historical fiction. I think the biggest genre at the time is historical fiction, right? The future fiction is a subgenre. It's really interesting. But past fiction, people like Rosa Mulholland, these are the names who write a huge amount, extremely influential historical fiction. And even though it's set in the past, supposedly not at all about home rule, they're putting home rule into it in subtle ways. And that needs to be deciphered, how home rule is projected back into earlier periods where it's not relevant. And that'll give you much more subtlety to that kind of slide, which you didn't get to discuss, of, depictions of women, what roles they play as they're thrown into the past, but they're actually appealing to a modern audience. Just a thought.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And yes, I am thinking about this. I'm thinking of broadening the corpus of fiction. I agree that the book by Vogel is very strange. Ireland is not that. The home rule issue is not that prominent in the book. It's more, as I said, it's more a book in which he advocates imperial federation. together with this question of women's rights. I'm not sure he got everything right, though. As I said, he imagines the United States being run by a woman, and that he got wrong. And it's not likely to happen anytime soon. No, and I agree with you that I would have to broaden the corpus, and I'm thinking of using, if I can lay my hands on it, Eileen Riley's thesis. It's a thesis dealing with historical and political novels. So I think if I manage to read this, maybe I'll come across more novels written by women or written by men, and dealing with this issue of home rule, but not as a future prospect, as a historical subject. So I mean, in this slide, I only included 2 titles that I've come across so far. Frances Mabel Robinson's The Plan of Campaign. I mean, I haven't yet read them, so I don't know how useful they can be. Annie Swan, Son of Erin. I think it focuses on Parnell, or it includes Parnell as a character. So those could be interesting, but I have not yet read them, so I'll see. Hopefully they are.
Yes.
I mean, a point of information, Robbie Meredith did a PhD thesis on Irish women's prose writing, 1890 to 1920, and that's available through the library here.
Okay.
It's 1999. And the second point is a question, which is the first postcard you showed us, the black and white one.
Yes, this one.
And I don't know, it may be just because of where I'm sitting and the ice cream, but is the female figure at the back a caricature of Queen Victoria?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, I could show you this, and you could look closer.
No, it's just that I mean, you mentioned.
I mean, it's true that she's. I mean, she's a bit dressed. I mean, she's dressed like Victoria. I can see the resemblance with the old Victoria and the photographs we have.
It's just the trope of female representation of.
But at the same time, the center character is dressed in the same way with the shawl over her head, and so it's difficult. I mean, it's to me, is it the typical fashion for women of a certain age in Ireland at that stage, or is it a reference to Victoria? I'm not so sure. It's not that. To me, it's not that clear, but.
No, that's how maybe a function just where it's sitting.
Yeah, it's
Okay. Do we have other questions? Yes.
This is a self-indulgent of my part. I'm doing some research into the development of the Alliance Française on the island of Ireland, and I just wondered, had you come across any among these particularly women writers, the Irish, sort of the Anglo-Irish gentry, because there's a lot of them were involved in the early Alliance Française in 1907 onwards. Just wondered, had you come across maybe Lady Gregory, or I haven't come across them in the context of the Alliance Française, but I wondered, had you come across any links to France among these people?
Well, there's definitely connections between Irish nationalists and France. I mean, the Fenians use France as a place for as a safe haven, a place of exile, and there's been books written by French colleagues studying those links between France and Ireland. As far as women and their involvement in the network of Alliance Française in Ireland, no, I don't have the knowledge to be able to answer that specific aspect of your question.
Okay, I think it falls to me then to ask the cat iconography question. And that's it. I mean, it strikes me that the kind of images you're showing us there seem to owe something to the incredibly popular kind of Lewis Wayne anthropomorphized cats of the period, which are kind of there to amuse, not political at all. But kind of these slightly political images of cats And then, I mean, I'm contrasting them with the highly politicized cat representation of the Kilkenny cats, much loved trope by Punch in particular, in depicting infighting within Irish nationalism. You know, the coming out of the song of the Kilkenny cats that fight until they leave nothing but their tails behind them. You know, so in the 1840s, you've got O'Connell and Smith O'Brien fighting in this way. I think there are 1880s examples as well. So I'm just wondering whether that image appears in postcards at all. That's very obviously male cat, tomcat fighting representation, a very negative one about Irish politics when it's used by English commentators. Is there anything of that sort, or are we dealing simply with a rather kind of harmless?
The harmless cat. No, the only thing I've come across, but it was just in passing, and I regret not collecting it and storing it somewhere, is a sort of, I think, a cat poem in relation to Edward Carson.
Oh, yeah.
So that would be more in keeping with what you evoke. You know,
one sitting on the fender.
Yeah, so that's the only instance I can think of you know, a more political cat. I agree. Like for me, maybe this is more commercial, and I mean, this is more clearly commercial than political. But it's interesting if you. I mean, it's what I find interesting though is the connection you can make with the postcards used for the the suffrage movement, for or against the suffrage movement. That's where it becomes interesting. Otherwise, it's funny and entertaining and weird. But it's only when you realize that there are clear parallels between these postcards and the suffragette postcards that there's a more political dimension here, I think.
Okay. Any other questions about cats? Yes.
Why did the cats in the home cards look creepy, but the one in the suffrage postcards look cute?
Why? What? Sorry, I didn't. I failed to catch that completely. So, why do they look cute?
They look creepy in the home. It was something you pointed out. They look creepy in the home rule postcards, but in the suffrage ones, they look cute.
Yeah, they look. I don't know if they look cute. I mean, I don't know if they look cute, and I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure they're real cats to begin with, and I'm not too sure they look cute. I mean, they look as if they wish they were in a different place altogether. So it looks a bit awkward. Now, interestingly, you know, you have a cute kitten here, but in the so this is borrowed from the Anne Lewis collection. And what's written at the back of this item is actually from someone against the suffrage movement. So it's interesting. It could be, I want my vote. It's clearly pro-suffrage, but they could be bought and used by people against the suffrage movement. Now, yeah, I mean, I know that I don't know, maybe it's a failure of, you know, it's just the artists failing to make these cats cute as well. And clearly this is not a real cat. It's totally artistic. I mean, it's a painting or, this is not I don't think it's a photograph. And if it is, it's a fake cat, not a real one. I mean, no cat would accept being tortured in such a way, I think. I mean, I think they were meant to look cute, but they don't. They look weird.
Yeah, you haven't got figures for how many of these were bought, presumably, whether they succeeded or not as a commercial.
No, I don't know how. Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, it's difficult to know how successful they were because I don't think there's been enough research done to establish how many were produced at the time, and all we have is a few items left, either held by libraries or sold on eBay and bought by people like me. So
okay, so research into cat imagery, I think a lot of work still to be done there.
Yes.
But if you're interested in following up on what Pauline has said today about fictions of the future relating to Ireland, I strongly recommend the book Imagining Ireland's Future 1870 to 1914, which will be available in our library soon, if it's not there already. So can I ask you to thank Pauline for coming all the way from Strasbourg to speak to us today? And just before everyone goes, so we're taking a bit of a break over the Easter vacation. We've got another talk coming up on the 8th of April. Andrew Holmes of this parish will be talking on a not totally unrelated subject, the Northern Revival Presbyterians and the second series of the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, 1894 to 1911, which of course Alice Milligan was involved with. So that will be on the 8th of April, 4:30 in this room. We do have a book launch between now and then on the 21st of March. Book launch of David Torrance's book, The Wild Men, The Remarkable Story of Britain's First Labour Government of 1924. That's Thursday, 21st of March, 4 p.m. in this room. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.